I am Alistair Hirst. I'm Senior Game Developer Relations Manager at Dolby. I've been at Dolby about 2 years. Prior to that, I was in the game industry for 29 years, including 10 years at EA, 10 years running my own game audio company, and 6 years at Amazon. I bring that up because I have worked on just about every aspect of game audio, from sound design, music composition, audio programming, back before there was middleware, to audio director, which is what I spent most of my career doing. And I have created games in just about most of the genres: sports, racing, far too much racing, MMOs, RTS games, and a huge variety of size of games. Most of my career's been big AAA titles, like Halo 2 or the Need for Speed franchise. But I've also worked a lot on the Xbox Live Arcade games back in the day, and then I also had a little side company that we gave a shot to do some iOS games back when it looked like that was the thing going, where startups could get into there before it went to the free-to-play model. So that's sort of my background and where I'm coming from on this talk. For Dolby, the job that I do is talk to developers and explain what Atmos is and how they can put it into their games and why they would want to, which is kind of what I'm covering today in this talk. So games, as we're all well aware, are part of popular culture, right? And it seeps into all these other different medias. And Dolby is present in entertainment across all these different forms of media. And you can, of course, experience Dolby Atmos in games now, which is partly what I'm talking about today, and sort of give you an idea of how you can do that. So I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson. Back when dinosaurs roamed the earth and I did my first game, was for the Sega Genesis, which was one channel connected to a TV which had one speaker, right? And then we went and expanded to stereo. So on the Super Nintendo, I did those games, and we were able to get stereo working on those games. My first version of Need for Speed came out on the 3DO, which was the first game. Not everyone's heard of that game. It was the first game console in North America that shipped games on a CD-ROM drive, so we were able to stream the music. And I did the audio programming for that game, because there was no middleware at the time. But I worked with a very smart programmer who was much smarter than me, who actually figured out how to do interactive Dolby Pro logic on that game. And I bring that up because what I'm going to be covering today is how Dolby technology allows you to do more creative things. And you can take your creative intent and then use the tools that Dolby provides to realize that creative intent. So an example of what I did on that very first Need for Speed, a big part of that game was getting chased by the cops, right? And trying to get away from the cops. So by putting Dolby Atmos Pro Logic into that game, you were able to drive, you could hear behind you where the cop was, and then as the cop started going either to the left or right, you could hear that and then steer across to block the cop. So the creative intent was for that, give the player the information they needed to block the cop so they could get away. Right? And that was the creative intent. And then using Dolby Pro Logic, we were able to realize that. So from the 4 channels, we went to the Xbox, which was the first console which supported Dolby Digital, which was 5.1. I can give you an example there too. I worked on Microsoft's hockey game. Yes, Microsoft had a sports division for a while during the launch of the Xbox. And so we recorded the crowds for the hockey game in true surround sound. We did a quad recordings, went to a bunch of NHL games and got permission to hang a mic array over the audience. And they were really careful. They were on thick cables. There's no way that thing was falling. So we got these fantastic recordings of crowds in surround sound. And we beat EA to the punch. Ours was the first game to have true surround sound crowds in their game, because at the time they were supporting PlayStation 2, which was only stereo. The Xbox was Dolby Digital, supported 5.1, and it had a hard drive, which the other games didn't have. So we were able to stream our crowds in surround sound. And so there were times we had crowd murmurs, and we had all these reactions going on, and we basically edited out all these things, and then we're triggering them in the game. So there was times as we were overlapping all these streams, we would hit up to 9 quad streams of crowds going on the whole time. So here's where it comes to the creative intent thing again. Our creative intent was to immerse that player in the game, put that player in that arena, watching that hockey game, and obviously controlling that hockey game. And we know we were successful because there was a, I forget the name of what Microsoft called it. They changed it differently now. But basically, the first time you played that game, we had to transfer all that digital audio data off the DVD drive over to the hard drive for streaming. And in their terms, you weren't supposed to take longer than X number of seconds to transfer that data over. We had this massive amount of crowd recordings that went over. And so they said, we can't do this. How do you make this shorter? And I said, well, the fallback is we use just stereo crowds, that'll be half the size, so that'll cut down in half, and we should make it under. But then we set up a demo for them, where we put up a very cheap 5.1 surround sound system and played them true surround sound crowds reacting and all this stuff, and you can hear, stuff bouncing around, all coherent, or fake surround where we had dual stereo. So it wasn't true surround stuff. And we played that for the producers and game programmers, and programmers aren't necessarily always the most friendly to game audio. And it became quite clear to everybody that the true surround sound crowds was far more immersive. That was the creative intent we were going for, and so we shipped that game, and because it was a Microsoft game, we were allowed to break that rule and ship the game. So the load time, first time for that game, was a bit longer, but our creative intent was there. So that was the Xbox. Then later consoles went up to 7.1 channels. And then that brings us up to today, where we have Dolby Atmos, which supports 7.1.4 channels. So you get Dolby Atmos today on the Xbox One, the Xbox Series X and S, on PCs, and it's also available on Android phones, including Samsung phones. So those are shipping 1 million a day, as well as iPhones and iPads. So it's a brief history of channels of game audio. Dolby Atmos allows us to surround the listener with sound by adding height channels to what came before. And it also allows us to support Dolby Atmos objects, which gives us greater localization precision. And I'll go more into detail of what that means in a bit. When I say 7.1.4, that first number, the 7, is the number of planar speakers around the listener's head. At ear level, we now have 7 speakers. The middle digit is the number of subwoofers in the system. So there's one LFE, one low frequency enhancement channel. That's that middle one, but it could be multiple subwoofers. So that's the number of subwoofers in your system. And then that last digit, the 4, is the number of height channels in your system. Part of Dolby's mission says to give consumers a premium entertainment experience regardless of how or where they choose to enjoy it. Because players now can play games across a bunch of different configurations, different systems, right? So we need to make sure that we're consistent and can give the best presentation we can across all these systems. And here's how Dolby does it. We create these tools, which we then give to creatives like you to enable you to create the Dolby-enabled content that goes into the games. So we got the content side there with that piece. But then we also go and we talk to the console manufacturers, and we talk to the mobile phone manufacturers and Microsoft on the PC. And we talk to them, and we get our Dolby encoding technology built into those platforms. And then we go to the consumer electronics manufacturers, like the TVs and the AVRs, and all that kind of stuff, in the cinema, if it's in terms of cinema, because Dolby crosses all these things. And we work with them to get Dolby decoders into those systems. So we have this whole ecosystem where we're creating content that is encoded with our Dolby technologies, and then it can flow through the platforms over to the endpoints and be rendered out on those endpoints. So what's an endpoint? Well, in terms of audio, for example, at the high end, we can have AVRs in people's home theaters, right? So that can go 7.1.4. Some people have 9.1.6 systems. So we need to be able to scale with these systems. Some of them might go down to 5.1 for a home theater, for example. Sound bars are really gathering steam with Atmos. There's a lot of really good sound bars coming out that support Dolby Atmos. Some of them will have up-firing speakers to give you those height channels. Sometimes they will have wireless surround speakers that also have up-firing. They'll have subwoofers. So the quality of experience you can get from sound bars now for a Dolby Atmos experience has been getting better and better all the time. There are TVs that support Dolby Atmos with rear-firing speakers to get off the wall and the ceiling. Mobile phones, as I mentioned before. Cars, I don't know if you got a chance to check out the cars downstairs with the music. I mean, talk about a killer app, right? Dolby Atmos music in a car. Every time I get to experience that, it's just the coolest thing. And then a game changer for gamers is headphones. So you can get Dolby Atmos over headphones now, and that matters for gamers because we know at least half of gamers are listening to their games on headphones. So we can give them a full Dolby Atmos experience over headphones. Now, if you're creating games, the problem you run into is you have all these different platforms you're creating games for, right? The consoles, the PCs, mobile, that kind of thing. And then you have all the different ways that people are listening to their games, you know, headphones, TVs, soundbars, AVRs, all those things I just talked about. And so if you don't use a technology implementation method that works on all devices, you have to pick and choose different workflows for producing the final games for each device and platform. But Dolby provides a tool set that allows you to author for Dolby Atmos, and then that will gracefully fold down and create, if you have a 5.1 system, we'll put the Atmos into 5.1. If you're running on stereo, it will collapse and go to stereo, keeping your creative intent, there's where it is, your creative intent as intact as it can for the system that your gamer is playing on at that time. This is a architecture diagram which I found useful to kind of understand how the audio signals are flowing in these games and how we get Dolby Atmos to those endpoints. So basically at the bottom there you have your game engine. When you're making a game, it could be Unreal, it could be Unity, right? And then inside the game engine you have your audio engine running. So that often can be middleware like Wwise or Fmod, or now available natively in the Unreal Engine. You can use Dolby in that. And so that audio engine is creating those 7.1.4 channels, steering the audio around. You're doing your mix, addressing that, and your objects. Those audio streams are then piped over an API, the Microsoft Spatial API, sometimes known as ISAC, and it takes that and communicates with the OS layer and moves the audio channels across, where in the OS layer on the Xbox and on the PC, we have the Dolby Atmos renderer, which then takes in all this digital audio and puts it into the Dolby Atmos format and then sends it out to our endpoints over HDMI, or binauralizes it and gives you your Dolby Atmos for headphones. So this is the signal flow, so anyone who's done audio engineering will understand what's going on here. So all the game engines, the audio middleware now support a 7.1.4 panner, and so we can stream our audio signals, there's dialogue or sound effects, that kind of thing, goes into the 7.1.4 panner, and then that can go and be assigned to your 7.1.4 bus, okay? You can also then have a pass-through bus, and this is for signals that you don't necessarily want to get spatialized, so internet voice chat, UI sounds, things like that. And then your objects, where you can get the individual objects, which, like I said before, have better localization precision. You get a certain number of those. And then those all flow through, like I explained there, to the OS layer where the Dolby Atmos renderer is. And from there, it goes out to your endpoint, whether it's your home theater or your soundbar, or it gets binauralized with Dolby Atmos for headphones, and it goes out to your headphones. So pretty simple once you understand it, and once you set up your bus structure this way, your game is ready to create in Dolby Atmos. Main bus is spatialized, if you choose to want it spatialized. In games, we use a 7.1.4 bus. Films, a little bit different, they use 7.1.2. On the Xbox, And on Windows, it will automatically determine if the user has spatialization turned on, it will automatically configure that as a 7.1.4. If spatialization is turned off, it'll just be garden variety stereo. And then on mobile, you need to specifically define your main bus as 7.1.4. For your pass-through bus, which is not going to get spatialized, we don't do any HRTF filtering, and I'll explain that in a second. And so things that you would potentially put in a pass-through is if you have just regular stereo music, you can pass that through. Although, as you'll see in the demo, I'll play in a little bit, we're starting to get more like what film and TV is doing, where we are spatializing the music and pushing that out to surrounds. Or your UI sound effects could potentially go to your pass-through bus. All right, and then finally, your Dolby Atmos objects buses. So those are routed separately from that main bus, and it includes this metadata. So in games, we'll often tie a sound to what we call an emitter in the game, right? So you got a bird flapping its wings. There'll be on that animation, your sound emitter will be on there. And then as it moves around the space, we have the virtual listener, which is like a virtual microphone. And then we have the location of that sound, that emitter. And so the XYZ coordinate is provided back to the game engine to know where that sound is in our soundscape. And that's included with the objects as it's passed across. And so each of those objects on headphones will get its own HRTF. I'm going to make a brief, very brief tangent here to explain what the heck that is. So binaural audio, how does that work? So when we listen to a sound, if we hear, this click here, there's a couple things going on in my auditory system. That sound hits this ear before it hits this ear. It's microseconds, but our brains are sensitive enough that it can detect that difference in time between here and here. So that's the interoral time difference. The other thing that's going on is when I click here, is that the sound that hits this ear is louder than the sound that hits this ear, right? Okay, so that's the interoral level difference. And then the final thing that happens that helps us hear and localize sound is we have these outer ears, and everybody's outer ear is different. But we have what's called the pinna, and we have these folds. So as the sound hits these folds and goes into our ear canal, it's filtering the sound in certain ways. It's like if you're using an EQ, you could see it as notch filters, right? And our brains take all this stuff in, and in fractions, microfractions of a second, does the calculations, and it's like, oh, that sound's there, or that sound is there. So that filtering that is applied with all the stuff I just went over is called your head-related transfer function. So in a game, if we emit a sound from up there, we apply that filter to that sound, and then when you're listening on headphones, it tricks your brain into thinking that sound is there, or what's super important now for games, it's behind me, or it's above me, right? Which can be really important in the game, is like, where's that enemy shooting at me from? You can tell more around. So when I say that objects get their own HRTF filtering, that's why it's a big deal. Each object is getting that same filter applied to it, so it's much better localization than if it was panning around the virtual speakers in the headphone array. Hopefully that makes sense. That I've been through a 2-hour lecture on this, so you can certainly go deeper on that, which I won't do. If you run out of objects, that's the final thing. Yeah, it will fall back and it will play in the bed, so you'll still hear the sound, it won't get its own fancy HRTF. Okay, I'm going to cover we're going deep into game development stuff here of how you set up your audio middleware, Wwise specifically to start off with, to create Dolby Atmos sound for games. So on this, you have your system configuration. You can see it circled in blue there. Top right, you set that to defined by device. And then that will get you started to get this all set up. If you double click on the system configuration, if you want your sound spatialized, you need to click on that button that says allow 3D objects. If you're going to use or allow 3D, that will spatialize your bed channels. If you're using objects and you want to use objects, you click on use system objects. You set your minimum system objects to 15. I won't go into it now why that's a good thing to do, but it defaults to 32. And then, yeah, just set that to 15. If you want to know details afterwards, I'm happy to walk you through the arcane details of that. Then another thing when you're using Wwise you need to be careful about is under the audio menu, there's this drop down for the enabling system objects. If you're creating your sound just in Wwise and authoring in that, you want to turn the objects on. You click on that box so that when your audio objects are instantiated in the OS layer, it goes to Wwise. If you're running your game and you want to hear all your sound coming out of your game, and you're just connecting Wwise to your game to control your parameters, you want to turn that off so all the objects are grabbed up by the game. All right, and then quickly how to configure those main mix settings. Underneath your main configuration there, you set up your main mix, your pass-through, and your objects like I was talking about before. For the main mix, you set that to same as parent. For pass-through, you set it there to same as pass-through mix. And then for objects, you set it to audio objects. So once you've got that configured in Wwise, you can go ahead, set up your project. You do your audio integration just the way you always do for your game, and you will be creating your game, and it will work in Atmos. Unreal is a little bit different, but similar concepts. Unreal doesn't yet have a full 7.1.4 bus. They have 7.1, so you start off with 7.1, and then we add a separate front height channel and rear channel. They will add 7.1.4 eventually when they can. It'll get on their roadmap, but they've been busy working on telemetry and some other things which are important too. And then they also have the ability to add objects and a pass-through bus. So to get it working in Unreal, basically you download our Dolby Atmos plugin, and then under Windows, scroll down to Audio and set the spatialization method to Dolby Atmos. You do that, and your game will automatically be in Atmos. So there's a starter game that comes with Unreal 5 called Lyra, which is pretty cool. It's like this is a little first-person shooter. So we were able to get Lyra into Dolby Atmos. Took 5 minutes. Download the plugin, click these buttons, and then boom, it was in Dolby Atmos. So it's very simple to get going. Configuration, Unreal doesn't call them buses, they call them sound fields. So it's basically a similar idea. You take the sound fields and you assign them to Dolby Atmos. If it's the height channels, you assign it to front height, rear height. You can, if you want to, say you have spatialized music, you can have multi-channel waves and you can feed those into your spatial buses. So that's how you do here. The thing I just want to call out here, if you're going to do that, make sure you're running in SMPTE channel order. There's a bunch of different standards for multi-channel waves. That's the thing with standards, there's so many of them, right? So for this particular one, you want to choose the SMPTE channel order, and then that will take all those things and will then play it out in Atmos. For Dolby Atmos objects, you take sounds or whatever, and you attach, if you've used Unreal before, you have your attenuation settings. You'll take your attenuation, and you just set it to Dolby Atmos, and then that will automatically create the objects for you. For your pass-through bus, you create a sound field, and you just don't put an Atmos plug in it. You just leave it as is, and it will just be regular stereo. So for Unreal, the supported platforms are Windows 10 and 11, Xbox One and Xbox Series X and S, and the Android, including Samsung. And then for Wwise as well, there's the iOS support. Okay, let's get to some creative stuff. This original medieval village demo was created 4 years ago. And then when they brought out Unreal 5, they've got all the new, some new graphic systems, right? So for improved lighting, they've got procedural vegetation, all this kind of stuff. So they're updating this demo. And they thought, well, we might as well take a crack at audio too. And so they went and they worked to up-res this demo to support Atmos for it. And so we then spent a week in one of our studios at Dolby headquarters in San Francisco in one of our Atmos rooms, mixing it to make sure that it was working the way we wanted, to hammer on the plugin to make sure everything was working. So this is the team that worked on it. The people from Epic primarily that worked on it was Adam Block, who works out in North Carolina studio, and Paul Gorman and Noah Landis, who are up in Larkspur in California. As I mentioned before, this was a pre-existing project, 4 years old. and it's getting reworked with the graphics upgrades. They're not finished yet. Those are not final graphics. And we took the audio and up-res that to Atmos. So here are some of the things that we did to get it into Atmos. So we took the ambiances, which were originally ambisonics recordings, and I split those out to 7.0.4 channels and then routed those to the channels. So as you move through this, you're hearing these background ambiances of background birds and wind and things like that completely surrounding you, right? All the channels are correlated, which, as I found out with that hockey sound crowd thing, is super important for really believable immersion. So the music stems, we took the music and we panned them away from the front channels. And there were 3 layers in the music. The music's pretty interesting, actually. It's made up of these chunks of music that are rearranging procedurally, randomly, as you go through it. So you're never quite sure when some of the parts are going to play. So it sort of varies up the music. So anyway, we pulled those out into the room. And then there's an ambient flute part, which we placed in the top back height speakers. And that, in our experiments was super effective. And then all the 3D sound points, which are already there in the original demo, we just set those to Atmos, and they just magically worked. So all good, we were good there. So some of the creative considerations that we took into account as we worked on this demo. The driving principle that we were thinking about is, are we supporting the overall expression and the mood of the game? Because the way audio works for games, and in other media too, right, is we're a very visually focused species, right? So everything we hear is processing here, but that gives us the power as audio creators to, influence the mood and perceptions of the gamer as they're playing these things. And so as you're creating these things, it's like, if I do this with the sound, is that supporting the goal of this? And then that usually is, as an audio director, that's when you're working with your creative director to make sure that you're following their overall vision of what you're creating. I want it to be spooky, I want it to feel tense, or I want them to be happy, or whatever. As audio people, we have a strong ability to influence those emotions, even though people don't even really notice that it's being done to them, right? We pulled all that stuff out of the front channels. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to leave sonic space for all the sound effects in the front speaker. So those birds flying up, the things there. With your eyes, we're so visually focused. So you were focusing and you heard things happening. The soundscape, the music was pulled out of that, so there's more clarity for those sounds up front. So that was the reason for doing that. Then the other thing we had to make sure was that the music still sounded natural and supportive. We didn't want it to sound weird or distracting, right? So one of the creative choices we made is, because all these chunks were being randomly generated, we quite easily could have, at the beginning of every chunk, had it randomly panned somewhere else. So we could have had these strings and parts bouncing around. We made the creative choice not to do that because we thought it would potentially be distracting. It's this ambient music, it's setting this mood, this tone. So randomly panning would be distracting. There's a different game called Avowed where they do a similar thing. They do randomly pan all over the place because for their game, that makes sense for their game. And then the flute was, we were a little nervous about it because what we don't want is for that flute to someone think, oh my God, why is there a flute player in the tree up there behind us, right? But we gave an experiment and it worked. We liked the flute back there, but the flute was really ambient. There was a ton of delay and reverb on it. So it was quite clear to a listener that that flute was not diegetic. It wasn't coming from in the game. It was part of the soundtrack. And so as a listener, you're perceiving it as part of that music. And so you're not looking back there for the flute player. It just is surrounding you. What you're focusing in is all those sounds, the crows and all this stuff. And then later on, there's, fires and a big scary thing at the end. All that's happening in front of you. So you're, as a player, that's what you're focusing in. And then the music is doing its job to support this moody feel, this vibe. We're asking ourselves, are we supporting the overall expression and the mood of the game, which is exactly what we succeeded in doing with the music like that, as well as providing more clarity for the sound effects up front. Another thing to think about, in terms of panning was forced panning versus natural spacement. So obviously with the crows flying up, that was tied very strongly. There was an emitter on that crow. When the crow flies over your head, you hear the crow fly over your head. But in this as well, we had wind coming up occasionally and we had thunder. That's not tied to any graphic thing in the game. So that was randomly panned around the space. Every time we triggered a thunder thing, it would randomly pan and give it a bit more natural feel, so it wasn't the same thing over and over. So that was the difference from the music. In this demo, in the middle, you go through, there's a bunch of trees that overhang it, and from the trees are hanging all these bones from skeletons, and you can hear them clanking around. So we definitely assigned those to objects because we wanted to make sure that we got the greatest location precision, because even in headphones, you can hear these things clinking and clanking all around you, and it's super creepy. So that got across our creative intent, make this creepy. Some of the technical considerations. For Dolby Atmos, your surround and your height channels are being base managed. In previous Dolby surround systems, that wasn't always the case, but with Atmos it is. So you can send full frequency sounds to your surround and height channels. You don't need to worry about sending separate LFE. That's all being managed in the system. Sounds below 100 hertz, humans don't localize sounds below 100 hertz, so you have to consider that. So when we put the thunder up in the heights, the sound designer made sure that there was a nice crack, right, of that thunder so that you could hear higher frequencies, so you could localize it from up above. But then we also added a separate low frequency effects channel to get some really awesome rumble and boom coming out from that thunder, right? So that supported the thunder, but you needed to, I can't remember if I talked about this now or later. Oh yeah. And then you have to realize on the LFE, if it folds down to stereo, the LFE channel is thrown away, which makes sense. So if you've got this great big, Atmos system on an AVR and you've got the subwoofers going, that's awesome. It will augment that and really sound great. But if all of a sudden you're playing on an iPad on these little teeny speakers, LFE is not as effective, so that just gets thrown away so you can maintain dynamic range. So something to be aware of with the technical stuff. Another thing to think about is using dome surround for your reverb. So there are surround reverbs, and there are some major games out there who do some super interesting things where if you're in a big cave or a cathedral, the first reflections of the reverb are tied to objects up in the height. So you will get that experience or that perception of height. If you have dialogue that's super important for the player to hear, don't put it in the heights, because you don't know, in some home theater systems, if they're using a soundbar or up-firing speakers, you don't know what the ceiling is made of. So it might be super absorbent, or it might not be, and highly reflective, and it also might be at weird angles, so the localization of that might not be as precise as it would be with discrete speakers. But as we've been talking about, Dolby Atmos works across all these different configurations, so this is one thing where you're not exactly sure how that will play back in all systems. So if it's really key dialogue, place it in the front. Stuff like weather, thunder, things like that, you can throw that up to height, no problem. As long as it's coming from the heights, the localization isn't as important, right, as some kind of dialogue. And then finally, you need to make sure that you check your final mix on speakers and headphones. So especially during the COVID years, people said, can we still do Atmos in our games? And there are a few major titles that you've heard of that's how they did most of their sound designers were at home working with Dolby Atmos for headphones for most of the mix. But then at the end, when you do your final mix, we do recommend that you go and make sure that it works across speakers as well. So translation, it will translate quite well, but you should double check it. Just like when you're mixing music, you want to listen on the big speakers and the little speakers, right? And then when it comes down to the fold downs, as I mentioned before, if you're going from your full 7.1.4, when it collapses to 5.1, your creative intent, Dolby engineers, I've been in the meetings inside Dolby, the engineers work very hard to make sure that will translate to 5.1 and then even down to stereo. So we work very hard at that. Okay, so If you're interested in the documentation, yeah, there's a QR code there where you can check out the documentation. You're also welcome to send an email. Well, thank you for coming.